Hello and welcome everyone to our End-to-End Rural Cohort webinar for 2024. So before we begin today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which our teaching sites are located. I'd also like to acknowledge the land of the Kulin Nations, which is where I'm situated this afternoon, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be joining us today. So today's session will include a brief overview of the Monash End-to-End Rural Cohort. You'll hear from one of our current fourth year End-to-End Rural Cohort students, as well as my colleague from Medicine Admissions. I'd like to ask if you have any questions, if you could please hold on to these until the end of the session, as we will be also running a dedicated Q&A session. So Monash Rural Health, or the School of Rural Health, as it's sometimes referred to, is Australia's oldest and largest rural clinical school. We're committed to improving health outcomes in rural communities and building a sustainable rural health workforce. With 8 clinical teaching sites and more than 25 community placement sites, our footprint stretches from Mildura in the northwest to Bairnsdale in the southeast in Gippsland. And at any given time, the school has at least 350 medical students studying across its wide geographic footprint. We pride ourselves in delivering a high-quality rural education program in a vibrant and exciting rural environment and training health professionals who are well-rounded and prepared for internship and beyond. And we do this by immersive clinical experiences which are unparalleled, and that is primarily because of the access to patients that our students have and hands-on clinical training. So a bit about the End-to-End Rural Cohort. The Monash End-to-End Rural Cohort is a group of 30 domestic students within the Monash Graduate Entry Medical Program who complete 3.5 years of their degree in rural and regional Victoria. The cohort is open to all domestic students, not just those with a rural background. End-to-End Rural Cohort students enjoy a great lifestyle, benefit from subsidised accommodation, and they develop superior clinical skills. There are 30 places available. You'll study your first year at Monash Rural Health in Churchill and then spend the next 2.5 of your 3 years of clinical training in regional hospitals and community-based practices across northwest Victoria. During your final clinical year, you can choose to complete a semester in a metropolitan hospital. This slide just gives a very brief overview of the trajectory of an end-to-end rural cohort student at Monash. So you can see in year A, which is the foundation year, you complete that at Churchill, and then 3B is undertaken in either Bendigo or Mildura, and it's a full year hospital-based clinical year. 4C is a semesterized year, which are made up of 2 18-week semesters. The hospital-based semester is in either Bendigo or Mildura, and the 18-week general practice community rotation is undertaken in either one of our GP hubs, Goldfields, Highlands or Swan Hill, and then in final year or 5D, you can either choose to undertake 1 semester in rural and 1 semester in metro, or a full year in rural. That's pretty much all from me. I'd like to now introduce Mitch, who's one of our 4th year End-to-End Rural Cohort students. Mitch completed his foundation year in Churchill before undertaking his first clinical year in Mildura, and he's now in 4th year and has completed a placement in Bendigo and is currently in Swan Hill. Thanks, Mitch.
Perfect. Thank you, Laura. So I guess a little bit about my experience. So as Laura said, all year A's start out in Churchill. So regardless of whether you're in the end-to-end program, or whether you're just, or if you're going back to Metro for your clinical training. But I think the amazing thing about Churchill is because you are essentially put out in a little rural town in the middle of Gippsland, you do build like a really strong sense of community, which I think is very important because as your only preclinical year, it's it's a time that you really do need that community and that support from your fellow students. And there's basically no one better place than the people who are doing the exact same program with you that you can rely on for that support. From there, I went for 3B, I went up to Mildura and spent the entire year up in Mildura. And I think again, my one big takeaway from my year up there was the amount of community and support, not just from the Monash staff up there, but the hospital staff as well, and the broader community. I think if there's one sort of advantage, or the big advantage of that is that community and that support. Um, I think the other sort of big advantage is that they're happy to support you in what you're interested in learning. In 3B, your main sort of objectives are, in terms of clinical learning, are Gen Med and Gen Surge sort of rotations. But my time in Mildura, for example, I also showed an interest in anesthetics. So they managed to put me in anesthetics for a week or two. I also got to experience ED, which I don't think happens in Metro that often, but rural seems to be a bit more regular that you get to have some ED experience, which is normally a rotation kept for final year. I also got to explore some cardio rotations, renal, other subspecialties. I think the other really important thing about doing a program rurally is that while you don't necessarily have access to super niche subspecialties, they will always show you what you need to learn and what you need to know. And because sometimes they're not as well staffed in terms of having all those subspecialties, a lot of things and conditions are funneled into one of a handful of teams. So in terms of the breadth of what you actually get to experience and see may actually be more than what you might see in a Metro setting where, say, some friends for their first rotation in 3B were placed straight onto an oncology ward. So that's all they saw for 6 to 9 weeks was just oncology patients, where Gen Med, where I was, you saw oncology, you saw cardio, you saw resp, you saw anything sort of internal medicine that wasn't surgery got put into Gen Med. So you got to have a really broad exposure to everything. I think the other really great thing about my time up there was the community. So outside of the hospital, outside of placement and other med students, the community in Mildura and in Bendigo are really happy to see young doctors in training coming through their ranks. And especially if you involve yourself in the community, especially if you're 3B, you're in a place for a whole year, there are, explore sort of the town, explore what's around. And if you have your special interests, bring them up with you and people are happy to get you involved. My time in Mildura, we had a projects officer, her name's Louise, and she literally sat down with us at the start of the year and ran through a list of things with us, like what are your sport interests? Do you do other things? And tried to put you in touch to help you settle into the community, which was just amazing. So then I went from Mildura in 3B to Bendigo in 4C to do my hospital semester. So I think the important thing is that same again. Everyone has to do psych rotation, everyone has to do obstetrics gynae, and everyone has to do peds. And no matter whether you're at Bendigo or Mildura, they both will support you to learn what you need to learn and see what you need to see. It's probably fair to say that those sort of specialties are bigger in a larger hub. So Bendigo does have a bigger psych facility. They do have a bigger obstetrics, gynecology, birth suite, special care nursery, etc. for peds. They have a bigger peds ward. But that isn't to say that neither is necessarily better or worse than the other. They're both great experiences from friends that I've had up at 4C and from the 4Cs I saw last year in Mildura. Both really had a good time and felt really supported as well. Of course, then, so at the moment I'm in my GP semester, so I'm back up in along the Murray. I'm in Swan Hill, and I guess similar to all the regional experiences I've had, they're happy to throw you in the deep end a little bit. So after week one, which we had sort of orientation and a few observing shifts, week two we were placed into our own consulting room so that we could start consulting and seeing our own patients straight away from week two. And that's going to carry through basically for the entire 18 weeks. And I think that sort of is an important distinction between metro and rural, is that the teams are often smaller. So your ability to get a hands-on experience, and especially if that's your way of learning, is to see those types of patients, to be able to like back up what you see or read theoretically with what you actually practice in terms of medicine. Rural is then for you. And I think the other really great thing that I think Laura already touched on is the fact that there is housing options if you go rural, very affordable, I will say. And you don't get that in metro. In metro, you either have to rely on your own rental, your own family, if you have family that you can stay with in Melbourne or whatnot. Not to say that, like, you know, that's the only reason you should go rural, but it is a nice help that you can do that. And that's, I believe, the same across the entire rural footprint. So whether you're on GP, whether you're at a hospital, there is some form of accommodation that is available to you if you need. But otherwise, I think the big takeaways for rural is that get involved because they are happy to get you involved. And the community spirit is just, honestly, I don't think it can be understated enough, really, in a rural setting. And I'm happy to take questions, but happy to sort of defer it into the main Q&A as well. I'm happy to stick around, and I'm happy to answer any sort of questions you might have from a student side about end-to-end practice. Thanks.
Thank you, Mitch. I'd like to now introduce Kyle, who is our Senior Faculty Admissions Coordinator for Medicine Admissions. Thanks, Kyle.
Excellent. Thanks, Laura. So I'm just going to run through fairly high level the admissions process for the end-to-end program. And there are a couple of changes for this year's intake. So if you have applied previously, or you know of people who've applied previously, there are a couple of minor changes coming into this intake. So excellent. So what will happen is course applications for the graduate entry medicine program will close at the end of July. A couple of days later, so we'll need a couple of days just to run through everyone's applications, check transcripts to make sure students are on track to meet minimum entry requirements. But around about the 2nd of August, we'll email all domestic applicants with information about how to log into our interview platform. When you log in, there'll be instructions to complete both a Dean's Rural List form, and we'll put that to one side. That's not the purpose of the conversation today. But there'll also be an opportunity for you to provide your course preferences, and I'll speak to that on the next slide. That form will be open from the moment we send that email out for about 2 weeks, closing around the 15th of August. Every domestic applicant will need to complete this form. If you don't complete the form, you won't be considered any further in the selection process. This is already updated on our website, but again, we'll continue to send reminders through that sort of 2-week window for students to jump in and complete that form. So the Dean's Rural List, effectively, it's a 2-part form. So it'll be Dean's Rural List and course preferences all tied into the one form. So if you are not a rural student, you can skip straight over the DRL part of that application. If you are a rural student, or if you're not sure if you qualify or not, you can provide your current and any previous principal places of residence. Again, noting that if you're invited to interview, you'll need to complete a stat deck. It's So there's sort of a couple of layers of confirmation that the information you've provided to us is correct. Again, not the purpose of the webinar today. The second part of the form is really where you can start to express your interest in the end-to-end program. So every domestic applicant, as I said, will need to complete the form. You'll be given 3 options within the course. So similar to VTAC, if you applied for our direct entry medicine program, there'll be a couple of preferences that you can list. Sort of standard graduate entry, the bonded medical program, so that's obviously for bonded places. And then you can also preference the end-to-end rural cohort. What's important to note is that for this intake, all places in the end-to-end program will be unbonded. So there'll be no bonded places in the end-to-end program for students commencing in the 2025 intake. All domestic applicants, as I said, will need to complete the form. You'll need to number all 3 boxes. So there's no opt-out, but if you're genuinely interested in end-to-end, and that's the thing you're most interested in doing, you can preference that first. If you really, really want sort of an unbonded spot that's not end-to-end, then you can preference CSP and put end-to-end second or third. You can do that in any order you want. That's entirely up to you, but you must number all boxes, as I said. So the timeline, again, this is all on our website, but it's just here for reference. And Laura, I believe the webinar will be shared with everyone later. But as I said, course applications will close end of July. There'll be sort of a short 2-week window to put in your course preferences, again, where you can indicate your interest in the end-to-end cohort. A couple of days after that, we'll send out our interview invites. As a reminder, that's based on your WAM at the end of semester 1. So it doesn't include deferred or supplementary assessment. It doesn't include winter results. It's your WAM at the end of semester 1. You'll have a couple of days to accept and schedule your interview. We'll run the interviews in sort of mid-September. And then course offers will be released as soon as possible after final results release for semester 2. So around about the 4th of December. That'll be the first round of course offers. If you're not made an offer in that first round, it'll be very likely you'll be waitlisted. And where offers are either declined or lapse, we'll make additional offers to fill the program as needed. But that is it from me. As I said, a pretty high-level overview. There is a lot of information on the website. We'll make sure to send links to that as well with the presentation that we send around after the webinar today. But Laura, I might hand back to you if there's anything else you wanted to add.
No, that's great. Thanks, Kyle. There are a few questions that have come through on the Q&A, which I'd like to now launch into, if that's okay. First one, I'm going to direct to you, Kyle. Average WAM required for entry as of 2024?
Off the top of my head, I don't know. And it probably doesn't mean much because the average WAM changes year to year. And the WAM only makes up 40% of the final ranking on the list for places. So the interview is actually worth 60%. Your WAM's worth 40%. The cutoff for non-rural students, again, regardless of end-to-end, the cutoff for students last year was, and I don't have it in front of me, it's on the website, I think it's 80 point something. Let me pull it up. But yeah, not really an answer I can give you a clear number on right now. And even if I could, it probably wouldn't be worth all that much, given it doesn't make up the bulk of what you're going to be ranked for in the end. So sort of a non-answer there, Laura, sorry.
That's all right. Mitch, I have one for you, if you're there.
Yep, still here.
Yep. Are there any university extracurriculars or extracurriculars in general that you can still take part in whilst on these rural regional studies?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what extracurriculars you're into and everything. So obviously, medicine is a busy time. So like last year, we were basically on placement. I had classes Monday to Friday, and basically same this year. But obviously you can leave your rural town. Like if you have things on in Melbourne, that you do or whatnot. Obviously sometimes geographical distance is a factor. So Mildura is, I think, about 6.5, 7 hour drive to Melbourne if you don't stop. Bendigo is a couple of hours and a regular V line train every hour. Um, so I guess it ultimately depends, but yeah, it doesn't stop you from doing things back in Melbourne or wherever. But also a lot of the placement sites will encourage you to, whatever you do in Melbourne, if you want to bring it up to Bendigo or Mildura, like both of them have a heap of sporting teams, gyms, music groups, theatre groups, whatever you're into and interested in. Medicine doesn't necessarily get in the way of that. Sometimes it might, like if you're on an ED shift, you might be doing like a evening, but most of the but you know, that might only be like once in a blue moon. And most of the time the placement sites are happy to work with you if you have to get away for a specific reason. They're very accommodating within reason.
Thanks, Mitch. Kyle, a string of questions for you. Does changing the order of our preferences change our chances of entry? For example, placing end-to-end preference 1, then BMP, then standard CSP, I'm guessing.
Yes and no. So the easiest way to explain it is what actually happens, and it's the same in the VTAC system for direct entry. So when everyone's completed their interviews, and to answer another question, when we have everyone's final course WAM, which is what you are ranked on at the end of the day for your course offer, we rank all the domestic applicants highest to lowest based on that ranking output. And the first student gets their first preference and the second student gets their first preference until we run out of places in that cohort. So if the first 30 students on the list all preference end-to-end first, that's the end-to-end full. And then the next person gets their highest available preference. So that's the way that it'll work for 2025 entry. It literally just goes straight down the ranked list. There's a couple of questions here I can probably knock off all in one go.
Fantastic.
Any subjects that are PGO, so pass fail only, or if you've got any subjects that are SFR, for students who are studying through the COVID period, they don't count towards your WAM. So pass grade is just a pass grade. There's no score that counts towards your WAM, so we don't count that subject. The WAM used is the Monash WAM that you'll see when you log in to WES. So obviously your first year subjects only count for half and second and third year subjects count in full. There was a question about taking into consideration work experience or Cs. No. For graduate entry, it's purely your course WAM weighted at 40% and then your interview performance weighted at 60%. For students who've experienced disadvantage or difficulties during study, the expectation or the hope is that you've taken advantage where possible of supports that the university offers students, whether that's DSS or other accommodations, extensions, etc., to assignments as you've gone along. So there's not a cease type offering for graduate entry, whereas there is for direct entry.
Any tips for the MMI and applying for the program?
Mitch can probably comment on this, I believe, but what I would suggest is interviews are now entirely online. So one thing that's really good to do is to practice speaking with other people on a camera, because the way that you are perceived on camera is very different. You don't have the advantage of a lot of body language that you might otherwise use face-to-face. And it is a little bit different speaking sort of direct into camera and maintaining eye contact on a screen. Some of you may be better at that than I am, given a lot of people would have studied through COVID. But that's one thing to do. I'd suggest practicing with other people, both friends, but also people you're less acquainted with. There can sometimes be a chance when you're in a big group of friends that you kind of just reinforce each other. and the feedback isn't always as honest if you're too supportive. By contrast, some friend groups are completely opposite, and you'll just be bluntly honest with each other. But Mitch, I might hand over to you and just sort of, you can add to your experience at the interview and preparing as well.
I think the big thing that's different with the Monash MMIs compared to, say, other universities is that they're not necessarily relying on like prior knowledge. Like some other universities have very sort of strict, sort of traditional MMI stations, like you have to explain what a cell is to a child, or, you know, to sort of assess your ability to communicate hard topics and languages. To the Monash MMIs, I think, are a lot more about assessing you as a person. So I honestly think probably my biggest number one tip for approaching the Monash MMIs is, first and foremost, answer the question that's actually been asked of you. I think sometimes some people who get too bogged down on practice and whatnot, and being over prepared, sometimes start to veer into trying to answer the question that they have prepared an answer for, as opposed to actually answering the question that is asked. That is probably my first and my biggest tip of approaching the MMI. And the other thing is that the Monash ones are really sort of assessing who you are as a person. You know, is this someone who they can see being a doctor or in the future and happy to do so? So you don't necessarily need prior knowledge, but just the ability to explain your thinking, explain it clearly, and yeah, just kind of that show that you're a human, basically. Would you like me to answer the question about the BNP? Because
yes, please.
I can do that, also being an end-to-end and bonded student.
Yeah.
The current way the bonded program has gone through, I think it's now in its third iteration of how it's meant to be paid back. Basically, you have a 3-year return of service contract with the federal government, but they've really sort of changed the way that it gets paid back. So basically, you have now up to 18 years after you graduate to give back your 3 years full-time equivalent. And that can be done full-time, part-time, fly in, fly out, casual contracts, whatever. As long as you sort of do your 3 years full-time equivalent within that, I'm sorry, my computer does that. As long as you do your 3 years full-time equivalent in that span of 18 years, they've also changed it now that you're meant to do a year and a half before you become a specialist or become a GP or whatever. And you're meant to do a year and a half after, except for when you hit year 12 after graduating. If you're a PGY 12 and you're not a specialist at that point, anytime rural after that counts back to your return of service. And basically your options for return of service lock in when you sign your contract. So if you have a look at something, I'm not sure the name of it, but if you literally look up medical workforce location into Google or whatnot, it'll come up with the federal government website, and it's all based on the modified Monash model. So basically anything that is MM2 to MM7 counts as return of service. So you don't have to go to the absolute middle of the country to give back your return of service. Places like Bendigo count as MM2 and so count as return of service. I think the only sort of non-Melbourne place in Victoria that isn't that is MM1 is Geelong. So it's counted when you do internships as part of the rural program if you want to do a rural internship, but it doesn't count as a return of service for if you're bonded. And worst comes to worst, if you can't meet your obligations, you basically pay out the program. So you basically, a BNP is essentially a government subsidized CSP place, for lack of a better phrase. So you'll basically, if you can't pay back your service in terms of time in regional areas, you'll actually owe them the monetary value of your degree that the government covered, essentially. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Mitch. The question around how many spots are there for other disciplines, for example, physio, it's my understanding, Kyle, that 50 spots are quarantined for biomedical science. And is that right? And then
That's 70% of spots.
And then
70% of spots at a minimum are for
yeah.
students who graduated from the Bachelor of Biomedical Science or any double degree combination. So if you've got a Bachelor of Biomedical Sciences as either as a single degree or double degree, minimum of 70% of the spots for domestic students are held for that cohort. The remaining 30% of spots are for all applicants. That includes biomed.
Oh,
Biomed
okay. So
science, physio, pharmacy.
okay, biomed science, physio, and pharmacy.
Pharmacy, and then this year, for the first time, I think we'll have the first intake coming through from Fed Uni.
That's correct.
The
Yes.
Gippsland Partnership Program. So the way that's done, again, that's purely based on ranking. The way that that works tends to be that biomed ends up with pretty much bang on 70% of spots, because once you've given 70% of the spots to biomed, and then you look at the ranked list, everyone that's left at the top is kind of non-biomed because you've already gone down the list, if that makes sense. So that's not to say, I think there's a misconception out there that we hold a set number of places for science and a set number of places for pharmacy. That's not how it works. There are only a set number of places for biomed. The other 30% is just everyone running down the rank list. So there's no preference for students from particular backgrounds for those remaining places. As I said, Laura, it works out to about 50 places-ish, but it's, technically 70%. And that's just in the event that Commonwealth funding for CSP places changes. If we can suddenly make more places or less places in a certain year, it's just capped at that 70%.
Yeah. So there's a question here about, is there any potential to be accepted into rural and want to undertake BMP as well? So for next year, Kyle, you cannot be an end-to-end rural cohort student and BMP. However,
correct.
You can.
That's not to say.
That's not to say you can't be BMP and be part of the graduate entry medicine program and then go.
Yes, rural. I mean, I think there's kind of two ways to look at it. If you're end-to-end from 2025, then you'll be end-to-end through the course. So you'll be studying rurally for the bulk of the graduate entry program.
Yeah.
There won't be that return of service obligation to work rurally post-graduation, but that's not to say that you can't do that. If you are genuinely interested in returning back to a rural location to work post-graduation, you can absolutely do that. The only thing here is that there won't be an obligation on you to do that.
And can I just say,
conversely, if you're a bonded student, and so not part of the end-to-end, you can still preference, and Laura can probably talk to how that preferencing process works. You can preference to study in Bendigo, Mildura, Swan Hill throughout the course. So you can still study rurally, even if you're not part of the end-to-end cohort.
Correct. And what the School of Rural Health has introduced this year is that if you are a student of rural origin, or you are a Dean's Rural List student, and you are super keen to be allocated to a rural placement in either 3B, 4C, 5D in your hometown or in your home region, then the School of Rural Health will actually prioritise those preferences for those students. So you could apply for BMP as part of the graduate entry medicine program if you're, let's say, a rural origin student, because you're keen to practice in that region post-graduation as part of your return of service. And if you wanted to, you could actually do your clinical training as part of your degree in that region as well, because the school has now introduced this new preferencing prioritization for you. So so as Kyle said, either as an end-to-end student or as a BMP student, but not as an end-to-end student, you can still do it one of two ways.
There's a couple of questions here that probably tie together. So in terms of when you can apply, how many times you can apply for medicine, does the 70% of spots for biomed, is that only for students who graduate this year? Tying that all together, the 70% of spots for biomed is anyone who has a Bachelor of Biomedical Science. Doesn't matter when you graduated. So you can graduate biomed and you can go off and do a master's degree in something, you can go into the workforce and come back 5-10 years later and apply for grad entry med at that point. So there's no recency requirement. The only requirement, and this is in terms of how many years after graduation you can apply, you can only apply a maximum of 2 times for graduate entry medicine. So if you apply once and don't get in, you can apply a second time. That doesn't have to be the next year. That could be, again, 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, but you're just capped at 2 applications for graduate entry medicine. So just tying those 2 sort of questions together.
Great. And we have no more questions. I don't think, no, we don't have any more questions. We've answered them all. Wonderful. Well, given it's 5:40 p.m., I would like to, oh, hang on, there's one more question that's just snuck in. Oh, 2 more.
2 more, excellent. And it's all on admissions, excellent. Cool, so when you apply a second time, do you have to do another interview? No, you can only be interviewed for the program once. So if you apply for graduate medicine, rank high enough to get an interview, and you're interviewed, that's your interview performance that is used in any subsequent application. If you apply once, don't rank high enough for an interview, and then apply a second time and rank high enough, then yes, you can be interviewed at that point, but you're only interviewed once for the graduate entry program. And this is the other thing, if you applied for direct entry coming out of year 12 and you interviewed at that point, that interview doesn't count because that was for direct entry. So you can be re-interviewed for graduate entry. You just can't be interviewed more than once for graduate entry. So I don't know if I overcomplicated that in the end. And then there was a question about the number of places.
I answered that in writing.
Okay, 70, yeah. So there are, I think last year there was 74 domestic students who commenced. We say there's ballpark sort of 72. Again, as I said before, it really depends on the number of CSPs that are available from the Commonwealth Government, whether any students were permitted a deferral from last year, because obviously that then takes away from the number of places on new starts that we can have this year. But ballpark is around about 72, give or take a couple of places for domestic students. That includes end-to-end. So if you take 30 end-to-ends out of that, there's only sort of 40-ish spots left for non-end-to-end. So it's all encompassed in that one number.
Do offers for people who did interviews last year come out on first round day?
As in, I think if you did the interview last year, does it still come in round 1 this year?
Correct.
Yep. So we do not make any course offers until after semester 2 results release. Even if you interviewed last year, so we already have your WAM and we have your interview performance, we don't know where you're going to sit relative to everyone else until we've got everyone's WAM and everyone's interview performance. So there won't be any offers made until that sort of first week of December at the earliest.
Will you get a need
about honours? If you do honours, we don't look at your honours grades. We're purely looking at the WAM of the course you need to do for entry to medicine. So your biomed WAM, your science WAM, your pharmacy WAM, your physio WAM. If you've done a double degree, we're looking at the WAM if you're a double degree. So we're not just looking at your biomed subjects, we're looking at the degree or double degree that you've used to apply for entry. But if you've gone on and done honours or masters or any other form of study, we're not looking at that. That won't contribute towards your WAM for ranking. Will you get an email if you're not successful at getting an interview? Yes, we will email all applicants, whether you receive an interview, are waitlisted in the event that an interview place becomes available, or if you've not ranked highly enough for an interview. Everyone will get an outcome. Similarly, in December through January, as we do sort of multiple offer rounds, you'll also get an email as to whether you've been successful, unsuccessful, or waitlisted pending places becoming available. So we'll continue to communicate with students, both through that sort of August, September period for interviews and then December, January for course offers. I feel like I've just started an avalanche of more questions about honours. When I was talking about honours, I'm talking about an honours program that's not on the list of courses you need to do for entry to graduate medicine. So if you've done a Bachelor of Physiotherapy honours, that's 4 years, we use that WAM of the 4 years because you need to do physio honours to qualify for entry to graduate medicine. By way of contrast, if you've done a Bachelor of Science, which is 3 years, and then you go on and do honours in anything, science or not, we don't look at that honours. We're looking at the 3 years for science students, the 3 years for biomed students, the 4 years for pharmacy honours, and then the 4 years for physiotherapy honours. If you've done a double degree, so commerce biomed, arts biomed, we'll be looking at the 4 years of that double degree. So we're looking at the entire WAM of the course you've used to apply for entry to graduate medicine. Hopefully that makes sense. Is a transcript required for application? No. We'll access all student results through WES directly. So when you apply as a Monash student, you just put in your student ID, you log in through my application. We pull all the course results in the back end of the system, so you don't need to supply a transcript. If you've received another course offer that was a preference below med, does it mean you've already been rejected from med? No. So if you've submitted an application to Monash with multiple course preferences, so say you put grad entry med first and then you have a couple of backup courses in case you don't get in, or the other way around, you've preferenced a couple of other courses first and grad med lower down, we'll consider you for graduate medicine regardless of where you've preferenced us on that course application to Monash. So until you hear from us, you are still being considered for entry. So if you've got an outcome from another course, that has no bearing on your graduate entry medicine application. We'll consider you regardless. Again, you can still accept that offer and lock your place in that course. So you've definitely got a backup pending the outcome of graduate entry medicine. So there's no impact another course application will have on grad med. I'm hoping that covers pretty much everything at that stage that's been asked.
To start, you can't do another medical. You can't start another medical degree, can you? Can you?
I mean, you can like accept a place, but like my biggest thing is if you're already in a medical degree, why would you switch medical degrees? Like, you know, why would you change an MD for an MD? Like, as much as, you know, go for Monash, like, you know,
Well,
we love Monash.
Depends if it's an MD, I guess.
But true.
I don't know.
But I think like somebody from the Monash faculty said to my biomed cohort, because I think somebody had the exact same question, can you switch back to Monash afterwards? It's just like, unless you're, you know, a descendant of Monash or something, like what is your big hang up? Medicine is medicine. If you've got a place, like take it in both hands and run with it. And just with the master's degree thing, some universities for other medical degrees do accept further study to boost your WAM.
A lot of them, particularly the GemSAS unis, I believe, will look at it as a master's study as well. So it's a little bit.
If you have a look, if you have a look at I think it's the Grad Ready website, it actually has like a big compendium of like entry requirements, and it does actually list out which universities take additional degrees like honors, masters, etc. as to boosting your score, because not every med school does, and Monash doesn't.
Does hospital placement in undergrad count as work experience in your application?
So on work experience, I understand that the application when you apply to Monash does have a section for work experience to be provided. That's just because that's the way Monash at the university level has set up admissions. Within the faculty, we're not looking at work experience at all. So as I said before, the only things we are looking at are your course WAM, and if you're invited to interview, your interview performance. That's it. Nothing else is coming into the equation. for the ranked list, we're obviously then looking at course preferences, and then we're looking for the rural students who's on the Dean's Rural list as well. But we're not looking at things like work experience, other courses you've studied, anything like that.
And I think we've covered the pharmacy question, the honours
Yes.
in pharmacy. So I'm going to file that one away. Does Monash offer any percentage bonuses apart from being on the rural list?
No. So there's no percentage bonuses. There's nothing like subject bonuses that sometimes happens in VTAC for some undergraduate courses. We're just looking at your course WAM. Another misconception that, and I'm not sure whether this is part of the question or not, or just the way I'm interpreting it, there isn't a percentage bonus for being on the Dean's Rural list. It's a completely different category of entry. So as part of our Commonwealth funding agreement, so the funding the government gives us to support CSPs, so places in the medical program, we have to offer at least 28.5% of places have to be for students from a rural background. And so when students are applying on that sort of final rank list, rural students are competing against other rural students for those rural places. And students who are not from a rural background are competing with other students not from a rural background for places. So it's effectively two different rank lists, a rank list of rural students and a rank list of non-rural students. And so there's not actually a bonus in sort of scoring terms for being rural. It's sort of classification on a different list for the purposes of selection for entry. But Laura, I think maybe at this point, given time, we might wrap things up.
We might wrap it up. Thank you so much for everybody's attendance. Thank you to our panel, Kyle, Mitch. Thank you, Greg, for organising. Thank you, everybody. And I would just like to, just thank everybody, and thank you for participating in the Q&A session, and hope to see some of you next year.
The other thing to note, Laura, just as a reminder to everyone, I believe the slides and the presentation, a copy of the recording will be sent around to everyone.
They will.
There'll also be information on how to reach out to us if you do have any follow-up questions that either we didn't get to or any other questions that come up post this webinar.
Absolutely.
Yeah, again, echoing Laura's comments, thank you everyone for coming, and have a great night.
Thank you. Good night.